Hello, I'm Fred Rosenbaum. I'm the scholar in residence for the East Bay International Jewish Film Festival. Now, the recent film Stronghold is powerful dramatically. It's also highly accurate historically. It's a very faithful adaptation of the memoir by the doctor in the film, Nachum Verbin, who also co-wrote the screenplay. His version of the events in that fortress has been confirmed by numerous scholars. No less credit for authenticity goes to the veteran movie director, Lior Hafez, whose father was a tank commander on the Southern Front in the Yom Kippur War, and whose photo album of the Sinai battles was an inspiration to his children. The director, himself a former combat medic in the IDF, insisted that every member of the Stronghold cast be Army veterans, preferably playing the same role in the film that they performed in real life. A radio operator having been a radio operator, for example, or the tank crewman having served in that capacity. Hafez also interviewed many of the men who were in those bunkers in 1973, and he pored over military archives, including command logbooks. To me, the result is more than a docudrama. It's like a documentary with reenactments. Now, although Stronghold was released before the massacre of October 7th, 2023, I found it very timely. The Yom Kippur War was the most commonly heard historical analogy to the savage pogrom in the border kibbutzim, exactly 50 years and 1 day later. Unlike all of its other wars, in both of these cases, Israel was completely taken by surprise, even though its enemies had, well in advance, clearly stated their goal of annihilating the Jewish state. And the results were calamitous. 2,500 IDF soldiers were killed in the Yom Kippur War, the second highest total except for the War of Independence. Both wars encompassed multiple fronts. In addition to Egypt's attack across the Suez Canal, Syria simultaneously broke through on the Golan Heights. In 1973, 7 other Arab countries sent expeditionary forces, as did Cuba and North Korea. As we all know, soon after Hamas perpetrated October 7th, Hezbollah began bombarding northern Israel, and later the Houthis of Yemen attacked as well. Another important similarity is the deep involvement of the superpowers. In the early 1970s, the Soviet Union sent both Egypt and Syria enormous stockpiles of weapons, tanks and artillery, missiles and jet fighters, which would prove terribly effective. On its part, Israel received plane load after plane load of American military equipment, thanks to Golda Meir's deft diplomacy. The US has likewise aided the IDF in the current war, just as its enemies have been backed to the hilt by Iran. Both wars stand out tragically for the failure of Israeli leadership in terms of strategy, intelligence, and initial military response, leading to widespread recrimination from the public and the media. In both conflicts, the IDF was able to turn the tide and avoid further destruction. but Israelis' trust in their institutions, especially their government and the top rungs of the army, was shaken to the core. Let's look at the first slide. After the findings of the Commission of Inquiry following the Yom Kippur War, the one for October 7th hasn't even begun yet. But after the Yom Kippur War, Prime Minister Golda Meir resigned. You see her in the lower left. As did Minister of Defense Moshe Dayan, you see in the upper photo, and Chief of Staff David Elazar in the lower right. They took the blame. A major cause of the Labor Party's fall from power only 4 years later, succeeded by Menachem Begin's hardline Likud, which has dominated Israeli politics ever since. General Sharon, whom you see here in the upper photo, whose tactical brilliance helped win the war for Israel, later became Minister of Defense and Prime Minister. Okay, we can remove that. Yet even deeper than the profound political consequences after both wars was the almost seismic shift in the national temper. In 1973 and 2023, the country was overcome by grief, anger, and disillusion. The same lament was often heard. Things will never be the same. My friends who live in Israel or who have recently returned from there tell me it's still October 7th. Now, of course, there are many differences between the two wars. The Yom Kippur War was over in 18 days. The one in Gaza raged for 15 months and may shortly resume. In 1973, Israel fought a conventional war on battlefields, relying on tanks, artillery, fortifications, reminiscent of World War II. 50 years later, it found itself pitted against a terrorist militia operating out of a vast network of tunnels and embedded in the general population. But the most striking difference is that Israel suffered no civilian casualties at all in 1973, while in 2023, nearly 800 non-combatants, many of them young people at a rock concert, were murdered and thousands injured. And of the 252 taken hostage, a large majority were civilians, from babies to Holocaust survivors. Likewise, Egypt and Syria had very few non-military casualties in the Yom Kippur War, whereas in the Gaza War, tens of thousands of Palestinian men, women, and children have been killed, raising the question throughout the world about the excessive use of force on the part of the IDF. That was not at all the case in 1973. So the two awful wars I focused on are half a century apart. But Israel has been perpetually at war in major military conflicts in all but one of its 8 decades of existence. How can such a small population, 1 million in 1948, fewer than 3 million a generation later when the film is set, and not even 10 million today, How can it defend itself in this hostile region? The answer lies in the title of a recent book by an Israeli historian that stresses the IDF's uniqueness. It's called An Army Like No Other. Truly a citizen army, a people's army. It is the most important institution in the country, dominating the society and shaping its identity. The army is over 98% Jewish. While there are some Druze and Bedouins, the overwhelming majority of the Israeli Arabs, 1/5 of the population, is excluded, which further heightens this sense of the IDF defending the Jewish people. The army is the mainspring of national unity because it throws together Jews from diverse backgrounds, and breaking down suspicions and even stereotypes that they may have had of one another. The young commander in the film, Shlomo, who wears a kippah, comes from the Hester Yeshiva program, which combines the study of rabbinic texts with military service. Dr. Verbin, by contrast, described himself in the 1970s as a Tel Aviv hippie with long hair, almost like an afro, and wearing a beaded necklace. And he is so secular, he won't even fast on Yom Kippur. But the army brings those two together. It brings together kibbutzniks and city dwellers, immigrants face to face with Sabras, Ashkenazim in contact with Mizrahim, the Jews from Arab lands. Now, to be sure, few Haredim, that is, the ultra-religious Jews, serve. And that refusal adds to their isolation from the rest of Israeli society. This is currently one of the most bitterly contested issues, and even threatens to bring down the governing coalition. But while they're now they are almost 15% of the population. In 1973, the Haredim were far fewer, barely 5%. So their absence in the army was not as big a threat to national solidarity as it is now. With the exception of most of the ultra-Orthodox community and nearly all the non-Jews, there is near universal conscription for men for 3 years. Unlike other armies, it's difficult to get a deferment. Flat feet, bone spurs, color blindness, allergies, these will not result in an exemption, as they did for many Americans during the Vietnam War. Israel is also the only country in which military service is compulsory for women. Their term is 2 years and 4 months. And although for them deferments are much more widely granted, especially to those married and or religious, almost half the females serve, some in combat roles. But the standing army, while well-trained and well-equipped, is not sufficient in times of war. It numbers barely 150,000 today, and was less than half of that on the eve of the Yom Kippur War, when Israel was attacked by Arab countries with populations in the tens of millions that mobilized about 1 million soldiers. In such an emergency, though, the IDF can muster a reserve force, miluim, which is 3 times the size of the standing army. After their active duty ends, Former soldiers are obligated to train in a reserve unit annually for about a 3-week stretch and one weekend a month. These exercises for men up to age 40 to 48 literally bring home the Army's presence to young families. The reservist spouse and children are affected by the time set aside by this duty. They see the uniform and the military equipment and their loved one leaving. Military service becomes part and parcel of Israeli life. Of course, the family is painfully aware that in a crisis, the reservists can be called up with no notice, forced to drop everything else and serve for an indefinite time, likely in combat. In an interview of Army wives, one woman moaned, "There are 3 in my marriage: my husband, myself, and the next war." In the IDF, morale has been higher, camaraderie greater than most other armies. One reason is that relatively few Israelis make their careers in the military. Even most senior officers soon leave for jobs in the government or the private sector. So there's a high turnover in the officer corps with young people assigned to these posts, making the age difference among the ranks quite small. The commander of the Stronghold in the film, Lieutenant Shlomo Ardenest, was only 20, far younger than his subordinate, Dr. Verbin, who was 29. And that may explain Verbin's lack of restraint in challenging him. In the early decades, this youthfulness was evident even in the highest echelons. Moshe Dayan was made chief of staff at age 38. The Yom Kippur War, Chief of Staff David Elazar and Major General Sharon were only in their 40s. There's also less of an educational differential among the ranks than in most armies. Because of universal conscription, those with college, professional degrees, and advanced technical skills, they're drafted like everyone else and are often on par intellectually with their officers. The result is an army more egalitarian and informal than most. And you see in the film that the men address one another on a first-name basis, regardless of grade. Military leader is expected to win the loyalty of his subordinates through personal relationships rather than by pulling rank. One principle that facilitates trust is that the commanders often lead their men in battle, calling out, "Ahare, follow me." Consequently, many high-ranking officers have been wounded or killed in combat. General Sharon, you saw this in the photo we just showed, he was hit with shrapnel and famously wore a white bandage on his head throughout the Yom Kippur War. Another division commander in the Sinai, Major General Avraham Mendler, age 44, was killed in action. In the recent Gaza war, Israel lost the top colonel in the fighting, commander of a tank brigade. Now, the film, of course, revolves around another IDF precept, especially strong in earlier decades, of never surrendering, or rather, go down fighting and take your own life if necessary. a doctrine we hear adamantly voiced by several of the men in the fortress. Where does this come from? Well, it stems from the early Zionist notion of the new Hebrew man, rejecting the passivity, weakness, even cowardice of the degenerate diaspora. The death and despair in the wake of the Tsarist pogroms were seared into the minds of those who made Aliyah in the early 20th century and laid the foundations of the state to come. Of course, the Holocaust only intensified the imperative to fight back and not, you all know the phrase, not go like sheep to the slaughter. We hear this clearly from the young lieutenant, whose father is a sole survivor of the Lodz ghetto and Auschwitz. How proud his father is, Shlomo says, of a son who is an officer in the Jewish army. And then adds, how can I face him if I surrender? The platoon Sefer Torah that we see in the film was rescued from a synagogue burned by the Nazis. Now, aside from the shame of surrendering, it was felt that the soldier who gives himself up, while perhaps saving his life, jeopardizes national security. In addition to weakening morale, he will likely be interrogated by the enemy under torture and forced to reveal military secrets. According to this reasoning, rather than be taken into captivity, better to commit suicide. Thus, the army values the collective above the individual, as did the socialist kibbutz movement, which in 1973 still produced a large proportion of the troops and officers. Now, to be sure, over the past generation, individualism has overtaken collectivism in many facets of Israeli society. But the film is set in a period when self-sacrifice was still widely considered a paramount virtue, even to the point of taking your own life. There was a precedent for this well before the Yom Kippur War. And the soldier who committed suicide after being captured was hailed as a hero for decades afterwards. 1954, Uri Ilan, a 19-year-old kibbutznik, was part of a 5-man mission that covertly entered Syrian territory to retrieve recordings on telephone lines that were monitoring Syrian military communications. The squad was caught, and all 5 held in separate cells in a Damascus prison. Before Uri was interrogated, he hanged himself with a rope that he made from the mattress cover. The Syrians returned his body to Israel, and when it was examined, a note was found taped to his leg saying, Lo Baghdati, Lo Baghdati, I did not betray. These words, did not betray, were read at his moving funeral by Chief of Staff Moshe Dayan, who extolled Uri as the exemplary Hebrew warrior, generating a wave of reverence for him that spread throughout Israel. The leading poet, Natan Alterman, composed a popular song in his honor. A street was named after him, and later a popular hiking trail. Although the martyrdom of Uri Ilan is not mentioned in Verbin's book or in the film, the soldiers in the Stronghold grew up in the years following his supreme sacrifice, and it was likely quite well known to them. One of the most chilling scenes in the movie occurs when capture seems near and hand grenades are distributed to each man with instructions of how close it needs to be to your chest before you pull the pin. Let's look at the next slide, please. Now, certainly, the most famous legend of Jewish fighters taking their own lives to avoid falling into enemy hands is that of Masada, mentioned a couple times in the film. According to the historian Josephus, and his is the only account we have, in 73 CE, a community of zealots, almost 1,000 men, women, and children, the last holdouts in the Jewish war against the Romans, were surrounded by the enemy in a mountain fortress overlooking the Dead Sea. Rather than submit to a life of slavery, they drew lots and killed one another, so that when the Romans entered, they found rows of dead bodies. And to quote Josephus, did not exult over them as enemies, but admired the nobility of their resolve. There are many unanswered questions about this story, and I leave it to the archaeologists and the ancient historians to analyze its veracity. More important for our purpose here, though, is that Masada became a national symbol of courage. As the admired archaeologist Yigal Yadin, also the Army's second chief of staff, put it, the zealots were heroes who chose death over a life of physical and moral serfdom. Even today, new recruits of some elite units of the IDF are sworn in at night under torchlight after climbing up the steep mountain that was the site of the legendary suicide pact. Masada, as you see below, Masada has been featured in some of the country's most popular postage stamps. Okay, we can remove that. Thank you. The saga has made such a deep impact on the national psyche that some have argued that Israel has a Masada complex, a term heard as early as the 1960s, that it sees itself surrounded by the most barbarous foes and would rather die than be conquered. But I would interpret it somewhat differently. The slogan one hears is actually, Masada must not fall again, meaning we should never again be in the dire situation of those ancient defenders on the mountaintop. Still, that self-slaughter has been so valorized indicates that the prospect of apocalyptic destruction is never far from the Israeli mind. A Masada is not mentioned in any rabbinic text, and there's no support in Jewish law for taking one's own life when facing captivity or when in captivity. The main theme of the film, it seems to me, is the collision between this belief, the one expressed by Shlomo Ardenist, fight to the last man and kill yourself rather than surrender, and the one argued by Dr. Verben, coming from secular humanism as well as Torah and Talmud, namely, stay alive despite what you have to go through at the hands of the enemy. Now, let us look at how events led to this excruciating choice. Let's look at the next slide, please. Ironically, the roots go back to Israel's stunning victory in the Six-Day War 6 years earlier. One of the greatest military achievements of the 20th century. One small country facing far larger armies on 3 fronts not only prevailed, but conquered territory 3.5 times its original size. You see the darker green is the original size, Israel from 48 to 67. And the light green are the conquered territories. Its strategic situation was vastly improved by this. If we look first at the north of the upper part of the map, you see the Golan Heights. Well, that's a mountainous area of great strategic importance. It's only 25 miles from the Golan to Damascus. And from those heights with a high-powered telescope, you can actually see downtown Damascus. In addition, there were very few people living there. All in all, just an outstanding territorial acquisition. Then, in the center of the map, the West Bank. Now, that borders on Jordan, which was Israel's most lethal enemy. They had the best of the Arab armies. They're the Arab Legion. But before 1967, they had the West Bank, and Israel, at its narrowest point, was only 7 miles wide. That meant that the Arab Legion could cut the country in half quite easily. Now, with the West Bank, Israel is 40 miles wide, and there is a river adding to its defense as well. And then, of course, Gaza and Sinai, adding great strategic depth. Egypt, which went to war 1948, 1956, 1967, instead of being on the border, is now 130 miles away from Israel, across a desert, and on the other side of a broad, deep canal. Okay, we can remove that. Now, the consequences of the Six-Day War went beyond this territorial acquisition that I've been discussing. One was the damage done to the image of the Arab soldier, especially the Egyptian recruit, who was now seen as utterly incapable, disorganized, and demoralized. Indeed, in the face of Israel's lightning-fast ground attack across Sinai, President Nasser's army quickly collapsed, its men running home through the desert sands. And in 1967, Israel destroyed Egypt's entire air force on the ground in the first hour of the war. This notion of Arab weakness and incompetence, combined with the IDF's astounding military prowess, led to a feeling of invincibility. Adding to this air of self-assurance was the capture of the old city of Jerusalem, including the western wall of the Second Temple, now in Jewish hands for the first time in 2,000 years. This was interpreted by many, not just the religious, as a miracle, a sacred gift bestowed on Israel by Hashem himself. All of this helps explain the complacency that prevailed on the eve of the Yom Kippur War, barely half a decade later, and Israel's failure to anticipate such a massive and devastating surprise attack. Moreover, Anwar Sadat had replaced Gamal Nasser as Egyptian president, and he was thought to be more pragmatic. If Egypt sought to regain the Sinai, or part of it, he would likely choose a diplomatic course, it was thought. Now, to be sure, after the Six-Day War, there was shelling and commando raids across the canal, the so-called War of Attrition. But this ended with the ceasefire in 1970, when the moderate Sadat took office. So in early fall 1973, Egypt's mobilization of hundreds of tanks and missile batteries, several divisions of troops on its side of the canal, was dismissed by the IDF as merely training maneuvers. Dr. Verbin writes that 2 weeks before the war broke out, when he served in a different stronghold, a major general arrived, climbed the ladder to the watchtower, and came down saying, "Nothing, just another routine drill." The beginning of the film, you see how lackadaisical are the Israeli soldiers guarding the waterway. Duty in those outposts, usually for reservists for less than a month, was almost a respite from the stresses of everyday civilian life, if a boring one. Still, the IDF had to prepare itself in some way for an attack, remote though they thought it would be. What was the strategy? Let's look at the next slide. It was the fortification known as the Bar-Lev line, named for General Chaim Bar-Lev, who held that critical post I've mentioned several times before, Chief of Staff. He was Chief of Staff from 1968 to 1971. Essentially the coordinator of the armed forces. And on the left, you see the canal, Egypt on the west side of the canal, Israel on the east. This was the truce, the end of after the Six-Day War. Now, Bar-Lev's first assumption was that the canal itself, almost 250 yards across, and let's for now focus on the map on the left. The canal itself would be a formidable defense, especially that it's essentially in a straight line, affording good visibility up and down its 120 miles. When it was built in the 1860s, the massive amount of sand that was dug up was deposited on each of its banks, thus creating berms several feet high, yet another barrier for an invading army. Moshe Dayan described the Suez Canal as one of the greatest anti-tank ditches in the world. Now, along the entire east side of the canal, the Israeli side, Bar-Lev built about 40 ma'ozim, strongholds. The word for stronghold for fort, ma'oz. 40 ma'ozim. And you see they are the black dots that indicate them. The film is set in the very, very southernmost ma'oz. It's the very bottom of that map. It's called Mezach. which could be translated as wharf or pier. And these heavy concrete shells, almost like bomb shelters, they constituted a project which cost $300 million in the late 1960s, would be billions today. They were built a few miles apart from each other, each manned by 30 or 40 soldiers, and equipped with 2 or 3 tanks. They were to serve as observation posts, vital in those years when aerial photography, especially satellite tracking, were nowhere near as precise as today. The strongholds were also conceived as a first line of defense to contain an enemy, or at least slow down an enemy invasion until it could be repelled by IDF divisions swelled by reservists coming from deep in the Sinai or from bases in Israel itself. Now, this long string of stationary fortifications was opposed even at the time. As one historian summarized the critique, it's too thin to be a meaningful barrier and too thick to be an expendable tripwire, i.e., there's too much here in men and materiel to be lost in an enemy attack. Now, not only was this a seriously flawed plan, but the Bar-Lev line was far from fully operational in 1973. You don't see 40 forts here. You only see 14. That's because the IDF was convinced that an attack was unlikely. And so it abandoned more than half the strongholds and undermanned most of the others, so that there were only 450 soldiers guarding the entire canal. Now let's focus on the map on the right of the screen. And the bright red arrows are the Egyptian attack that was so unexpected. The scale and strength, the determination and the skill of Sadat's army was astounding. And we see that in the film. After a tremendous missile barrage, they released a smoke screen and crossed the canal in rubber boats, and then overpowered the strongholds or went through the wide spaces between them. In some places, gaps of 10 miles. They laid down pontoon bridges at 6 points. You look closely, you can see those red dashes across the canal. Within a day and a half, even as the IDF was still mobilizing the reservists, Egypt had 100,000 troops and 1,000 tanks on the Israeli side of the canal, and it had penetrated the Sinai to a depth of about 5 miles. If you look closely, you can see the red dashed line on the Israel side of the canal, and that's the extent of the Egyptian penetration. As the full Israeli army finally engaged them, and you see that in the blue arrows coming toward those red arrows, the true battle of Sinai began. And again, astonishingly, the Egyptians had the upper hand. No one foresaw the accuracy and destructiveness of their Soviet-made anti-tank missiles, some handheld, as we saw in the film. One historian of the Yom Kippur War entitled an entire chapter, "The Humbling of the Tank." And in another contrast to the Six-Day War, Egypt's jet fighters this time took to the air, bombed Israeli air bases, and destroyed over 100 IAF planes on the ground, and shot down about a half dozen others in midair dogfights. As the Israeli counterattack foundered, catastrophe loomed. For if the Egyptians were to advance through the Sinai mountain passes, then they could enter Israel itself and attack the civilian population. Moshe Dayan famously declared, "The third temple is in danger," a bone-chilling warning that caused Golda Meir to convene a cabinet meeting to consider using nuclear weapons against Egypt and Syria. Because this risked triggering the Soviet and even American nuclear arsenals, it was known as the Samson option. Yet another ancient analogy, i.e., bringing down the temple of the Philistines in modern times, meaning bringing down everything. This fateful moment in Israeli history was later dramatized in the Broadway play Golda's Balcony. Now, such was the desperate situation on October 13th, a week after the war broke out, and the day the decision to surrender was taken in the Wharf Stronghold. Really the darkest moment of the war. Okay, we can remove that, and please replace it with the next slide. Now, later, on October 16th, General Sharon led a canal crossing of his own to the west into Egypt, known as the Drive into Africa, because in doing so, he invaded the northeastern corner of that continent. Now, if you look at this map, you see the very dark black, that's the Egyptian army, their Second Army and Third Army on the Israeli side of the canal to a depth of 5 miles that I mentioned before. What Sharon does is he goes between them, just right above that lake, that's the Great Bitter Lake. Before you get to the Second Egyptian Army, there's a little opening there. His forces went right through there and soon occupied a wide swath of territory, which you see on this map. And if you look very closely, about a little more than midway on the furthest western side of Sharon's enclave, you see there's a marker that says kilometer 101. That's because his army, the Israeli army, is only 101 kilometers, 60 miles from Cairo. But even more important, his daring move completely encircled Sadat's Third Army. Again, that's you see that on the Israeli side of the canal in dark black. 40,000 Egyptian soldiers, yes, thank you, Gabor. 40,000 Egyptian soldiers had no way of getting in supplies or food or medicine or more weapons and ammunition. This is why on October 23rd, Cairo accepted Kissinger's proposal for a ceasefire, leading to a truce. But even if the men of the Wharf outpost could have anticipated such an extraordinary turn of events, it would have been too late for them on October 13th. That's 3 days before Sharon even launched his invasion of Africa. Okay, we can remove that. Now, Verbin urgently informed his comrades and by radio, the high command, that 5 men had already died. 3 were severely wounded and in need of emergency care. And 10 others faced permanent disability if they were not treated soon. In his book, he refers to the medical bunker as a psychiatric ward with depression, rage, and weeping. And in the film, we see one soldier who was shell-shocked from the beginning of the Egyptian bombardment. The doctor added that he no longer had antibiotics or even bandages, that food and water were in short supply, that his unit was almost completely out of ammunition. Even so, Verbin's option of surrender, even to the Red Cross, was vehemently rejected by Commander Shlomo and many other soldiers, and certainly not fully accepted by Moshe Dayan, whose hesitancy and ambivalence are well depicted in the movie. Let's look at the next slide. Here is Major Shlomo Lahat of the High Command, who later became the popular 4-term mayor of Tel Aviv. Now, in 1973, says, the people of Israel feed on symbols, and that post, meaning the stronghold, the wharf about, that we see in the film, that post has become a symbol. If it gives in, it would be shameful. So everyone should fight till the end and make it a second Masada. Now, 20 years later, he still holds to that view. If it happened again today, he says, I'd still be opposed to surrendering. Yes, I knew that their chances of getting out alive were slim, but I still think that an army post should not be given over to the enemy. Okay, we can remove that. Now, let's see the next slide. This is Dr. Verbin countering Lahat. And we see on the photo on the left is Dr. Verbin, the first day that he returned, his first day back in Israel. The middle photo is Verbin around the time he wrote his book. He's still alive today at age 90, and he made a stellar career as a colorectal surgeon and professor of medicine at Tel Aviv University. On the right, we have the actor playing Verbin, who I think did a superb job, Michael Aloni. Some of you may recall him in the TV series Shtisel, where he plays a kind of rebel there as well. He also plays 2 roles. It's the same person, but one is a young man, one's a middle-aged man, in another outstanding TV series that I would recommend, The Beauty Queen of Jerusalem. Now, here's how he counters the high command. Surrendering is not humiliation when our lives have lost their significance in the eyes of those who sent us here on a mission. We aren't kamikaze soldiers whose suicide had clear operational value. And we're not the warriors of Masada, whose suicide saved them from a life of slavery. What can Israel possibly gain from having us butchered? Then if we scroll down, we see the surrender itself. And to see the conditions they were under and the state they were in when they actually decided to surrender on October 13th. Okay, we can remove that. Thank you. Are Verbin's memoir and Lior Hafetz's film anti-war? I think that's an oversimplification. Rather, they seek to deconstruct the purely heroic view of war that, by the way, was glorified in early Israeli cinema. Although both are outspoken peace activists, they are also combat veterans themselves and believe that military strength is imperative for Israel's survival. But like the country's leading author, David Grossman, whose son was killed in the 2006 Lebanon war, they want to plumb the depths of the existential danger of living in the Jewish state, that the wages of war seep into every crevice of daily life, not least of all into the most intimate relationships. In the doctor's case, a very pregnant wife at home. The film starkly reveals another toll that war can take. And this was indicated in the passage that I just read from Verbin's book. That war sometimes causes the most loyal soldiers to be abandoned by their superiors, to feel abandoned by their superiors. This sense of being forsaken, being left behind, overcame Dr. Verbin as he and his comrades remained trapped in a besieged bunker, a fortress within a nation that is itself a kind of fortress. Yet he retains his humanity. He is imprisoned physically, but refuses to be a prisoner of zealotry. A story not only timely, but also timeless. Thank you very much.